J.D. Vance, the Vice President of America, had been hearing troubling reports about one of his diner chain locations. Customer complaints about slow service and rude staff had been increasing, and employee morale seemed low. Determined to understand what was really going on, he decided to visit the diner undercover, away from the political spotlight. To ensure no one would recognize him, he dressed simply in a hoodie, jeans, and thick-rimmed glasses, looking nothing like the polished politician people were used to seeing. When he arrived at lunchtime, the first thing he noticed was the tension in the air. The dining area was clean but outdated, with worn booths and faded decor. It wasn't a terrible place, but it lacked the warm, welcoming atmosphere he had envisioned. The staff seemed overworked, moving quickly but with little energy, clearly stressed by the demands of the lunch rush. JD could sense that something was wrong, and he knew he had to find out what was really happening behind the scenes. As J.D. Vance settled into his seat and observed the diner, his attention was drawn to Megan, a young waitress who seemed to be struggling under the pressure of the lunchtime rush. Her tired eyes and strained smile told the story of a long shift with no break in sight. She moved quickly between tables, balancing trays and drinks, trying her best to meet the needs of the customers, but it was clear she was overwhelmed. Her movements were precise, but each step seemed to carry the weight of exhaustion. Megan's ability to smile through it all stood out to JD, but it was impossible to ignore how exhausted she looked. She didn't complain, but her actions spoke volumes. The diner was busy, with the usual clatter of plates and chatter from customers, but there was an underlying sense of tension in the air. JD overheard several complaints about slow service, and he noticed a family at the next table shaking their heads in frustration. Megan moved from one table to the next, offering polite apologies and quick fixes, doing everything she could to keep things running smoothly. She was juggling multiple orders, refilling drinks, and picking up plates from the kitchen without missing a beat. But it was clear that the workload was taking a toll on her. As she rushed to deliver a drink to a customer, JD overheard the voice of the manager, Rick, booming from the kitchen. "Megan, what's taking so long?" he shouted, his tone sharp and impatient. "You're falling behind again." The customers nearby could hear the scolding, and JD saw Megan flinch, her smile faltering for a moment before she quickly regained her composure. The manager's voice cut through the hum of the diner, creating a tense atmosphere. Megan's face reddened slightly, and JD could see the anxiety in her eyes as she hurried to meet his demands. He couldn't help but notice how harshly Rick spoke to her, especially in front of customers. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he belittled her, as though she was failing him in front of everyone. Something didn't sit right with JD about the whole situation. He could see Megan's quiet struggle, but there was something deeper going on here. Something that wasn't just about the workload. As the tension between Megan and Rick continued to grow, JD knew he had to step in before things went any further. As JD Vance continued to eat his meal, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The din of the diner, usually filled with the sounds of chatter and clinking dishes, seemed to grow quieter for a moment, and then, through the thin walls of the kitchen, he heard muffled sobbing. JD paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, as the unmistakable sound of someone quietly crying broke through the noise. His heart sank as he recognized the voice. It was Megan, the young waitress who had been working tirelessly throughout his meal. He leaned in slightly, straining to listen, and soon heard her words, broken and soft. "I'm sorry. I haven't had a break in 6 hours. I'm doing everything I can." Her voice cracked with emotion, the exhaustion and frustration clear in every word. JD's stomach tightened. He had witnessed the tension in the diner, but he hadn't realized just how much it was affecting Megan. The constant pressure, the demanding workload, and now this, it was clear she had reached her breaking point. Through the kitchen door, JD could hear the manager, Rick, respond to her distress with nothing but dismissiveness. "No time for breaks," Rick barked. "Get back to work. You're falling behind. We don't have time for excuses." His words were harsh and cold, stripping any humanity from the situation. JD felt his frustration rising as he listened. Megan's sobs grew quieter, but JD could sense her shrinking under the manager's harsh treatment. She was doing her best, but it clearly wasn't enough for someone like Rick, who seemed to care more about speed than the well-being of his staff. As JD listened, he realized that something had to be done. He couldn't just sit back and let this continue. His thoughts raced as he weighed his options. He couldn't stand idly by while someone he had responsibility for, even indirectly, was being treated like this. Without hesitation, JD stood up from his booth, leaving his half-eaten meal behind. He walked toward the kitchen door, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew he had to confront the situation head-on. He pushed open the kitchen door, stepping into the cramped space where Megan stood, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. The moment she saw him, she quickly tried to compose herself, looking down at the floor, but her distress was clear. Rick, the manager, stood nearby, arms crossed, clearly annoyed at JD's intrusion. JD looked directly at Megan, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone cool but unwavering. The manager's eyes widened in surprise and he quickly took a step back. Rick tried to hide his unease, forcing a smile. No problem here," he muttered, but JD wasn't buying it. He could see right through the manager's fake calmness. Megan, on the other hand, had no such facade. Her eyes were red from crying, and she looked at JD with a mix of gratitude and confusion. "You're not taking a break?" JD asked Megan, his voice softening. She shook her head, the exhaustion in her features unmistakable. JD turned back to Rick, his gaze hardening. "She looks like she needs a break," he said, his tone firm. Rick, clearly displeased, scoffed and crossed his arms. "We're short-staffed and we don't have time for breaks during the rush," Rick replied dismissively. JD's jaw tightened. "There's always time to treat people with respect," he said, his voice low but filled with authority. The room fell silent for a moment, and even the cooks seemed to shift uncomfortably. JD stood his ground, refusing to let this moment pass without action. Finally, the tension broke when one of the cooks, a young man named Connor, spoke up. "Megan's been non-stop since she clocked in. She hasn't even had a drink of water." His voice was quiet but filled with a quiet defiance. Rick glared at him, but the damage was done. The truth was out. JD knew that things needed to change and he couldn't wait any longer. "She's taking a break now," JD said, his tone final. Megan hesitated, glancing nervously at Rick, but JD gave her a reassuring nod. "Take 5. You've earned it." As she slipped past Rick, JD turned to face the manager one last time. "You might want to think about how you're treating your staff," he said, his voice steely. "Because from where I'm standing, it's clear you're not running this place properly." With that, JD stepped out of the kitchen, leaving Rick to stew in his own frustration, and Megan to catch her breath, away from the pressure that had been wearing her down for hours. JD stood at the entrance of the kitchen, taking a deep breath before stepping in. His mind was focused, his heart beating faster as he took in the scene before him. Megan stood near the counter, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve, clearly trying to hide the emotion that had surfaced after hours of pressure. The manager, Rick, stood across from her, his posture stiff and arms crossed, clearly dismissing her distress. Without revealing his identity, JD looked at the two of them and asked calmly, "Is there a problem here?" His voice was firm, but the calmness of it seemed to startle both of them. Rick looked up, startled by the interruption, and Megan froze for a moment before looking away, clearly not expecting someone to intervene. No problem," Rick quickly replied, forcing a smile, trying to hide the tension in his voice. He turned back to Megan, still frowning. "Just a little miscommunication. Nothing serious." But JD wasn't convinced. He could feel the tension in the air, the unease in Megan's posture, and the dismissive attitude in Rick's tone. JD knew that wasn't how employees should be treated, especially not in front of customers. "She looks like she needs a break," JD said firmly, his gaze locked on the manager, not backing down. Rick's expression faltered for a second, but he quickly regained his composure. "We're short-staffed," Rick replied, his voice rising slightly, trying to justify his actions. "There's no time for breaks, not during the rush. We're already behind as it is." JD's jaw tightened. The words came out more forcefully now, no longer just observing but challenging. "There's always time to treat people with respect. You don't push people until they break. She's been working for hours. Let her take a break." Rick's face flushed with irritation. "Look, you don't know what it's like back here," he snapped, his voice growing more defensive. "This is a tough job and I'm doing my best to keep things running smoothly." But his words lacked conviction. It was clear to JD that Rick was more concerned about keeping things moving quickly than actually supporting his team. Before JD could respond, a young cook named Connor, who had been standing quietly at the stove, stepped forward. "She hasn't had a break all day," Connor said, his voice quiet but clear. "She's been running non-stop and we're all feeling it. Megan's doing everything she can, but she needs a rest." The words were simple but they carried weight. Rick shot Connor a glare, his patience clearly thinning. "Stay out of it, Connor," he snapped. "Focus on your station." But the damage was done. Connor had spoken up, and JD could see the discomfort in the manager's face as the atmosphere shifted. JD stood his ground, his eyes never leaving Rick's. "You're the one who needs to focus on the team," he said, his voice steady but full of authority. "If your staff is struggling, it's your responsibility to make sure they're taken care of. If you can't do that, maybe you're the one who's in the wrong job." Rick's face reddened, but he didn't say anything further. The pressure of the situation was clear. Megan, still standing quietly, glanced at JD and he offered her a small nod. "Take 5, he said softly. "You've earned it." Megan hesitated for a moment, looking between JD and the manager, but she finally nodded, slipping past the swinging kitchen doors to take a break. JD turned back to Rick. "This behavior isn't acceptable," he said calmly. "I've seen enough." He looked around the kitchen, noting the discontent in the staff's eyes. "I'm not just here to watch. I'm here to make sure this place changes." With that, JD walked out of the kitchen, leaving Rick standing there, visibly deflated. JD continued to quietly observe the rest of the shift, taking mental notes of everything he saw. The lack of respect for the staff, the overworked employees, and the harsh treatment all pointed to deeper issues in how the diner was being managed. JD knew he couldn't just let this continue. This wasn't just about observing problems, it was about making real changes. And he was determined to see it through. The time for action had come. After finishing his meal and taking a few moments to observe the diner, JD knew it was time to act. The tension in the air had only grown thicker, and it was clear to him that the issues at the diner ran deeper than just the occasional employee slip-up. He stood up from his booth and with a quiet resolve, he made his way to the back where the manager, Rick, was still trying to regain some semblance of control over the kitchen. JD didn't hesitate. He stepped into the room looking Rick squarely in the eye, and without any fanfare, he revealed who he really was. "I'm JD Vance," he said calmly, pulling out his company ID and holding it up. "I own this diner and 13 others just like it." Rick's face drained of color, his eyes wide with shock. "What?" he stammered, clearly caught off guard. The smugness that had been evident in his demeanor earlier evaporated, replaced by defensiveness and confusion. He didn't know how to respond, but JD didn't give him the chance to recover. "You've been creating a toxic work environment here," JD continued, his voice firm but composed. "The way you treat your staff, the way you've allowed this place to fall apart, it's unacceptable. This isn't what this company is about." Rick opened his mouth to argue, but JD cut him off. "Don't bother," he said, his tone hardening. "I've seen enough. Your behavior isn't just affecting the employees, it's affecting the business. This has to change starting now." JD made it clear that he wouldn't stand by and let this situation continue, not when it had already gone on for so long. "I'm going to make changes," JD said, his voice steady. "We'll start by ensuring better treatment of the staff. That means proper breaks, adequate staffing during peak hours, and a complete overhaul of how we treat our employees. I'm bringing in a new, respectful manager who understands how to lead with empathy and respect." Turning to Megan, who had returned to the dining room, and Connor, who had been silently observing the exchange, JD smiled and nodded at them. "I want to thank you both for your hard work," he said, his voice softer now. "Megan, you've been incredible. You've handled so much without complaining and it hasn't gone unnoticed. You deserve better than this." Megan's eyes widened and she seemed at a loss for words. JD turned to Connor next. "And you, Connor, I've seen the way you've stepped up. You've shown leadership when no one else would. I'm promoting you to assistant manager, effective immediately. You've earned it." Megan and Connor exchanged glances, both of them surprised by the sudden recognition, but JD wasn't done yet. He turned back to Megan. "I'm also giving you a raise," he said, his voice sincere. "You deserve to be compensated for your dedication, and I want to make sure you feel valued here." The weight that had been hanging over the diner seemed to lift just a little. Megan and Connor's expressions softened, and there was a new sense of hope in their eyes. JD could tell they hadn't expected anything like this, but he was determined to follow through on his promises. "This is just the beginning," JD said, offering a reassuring smile. "Things are going to improve here starting today." JD Vance had kept his promises, and the changes that followed were nothing short of transformative. The very next day he took decisive action, bringing in a new manager named Denise, someone with years of experience in the restaurant industry and a reputation for leading with empathy and respect. Denise immediately set to work rebuilding the team's morale, focusing on clear communication, fostering collaboration, and ensuring that no one felt overworked or undervalued. She made it a priority to check in with each team member regularly, creating an environment where they felt heard and respected. This shift was a relief to Megan and Connor, who had both felt ignored and underappreciated for far too long. The new manager's approach brought a sense of calm and focus to the diner, and soon the atmosphere felt lighter and more positive. Along with hiring a new manager, JD also addressed the staffing issues that had plagued the diner for months. He ensured that the diner was adequately staffed during peak hours, which helped reduce the pressure on employees and improved service. He also introduced a more flexible scheduling system, making sure that everyone had the proper breaks they needed to recharge. Megan, who had been working non-stop without a break, finally had the chance to rest, and she found herself feeling less stressed and more energized. The customers quickly noticed the difference too. Service was faster, the staff seemed genuinely happy to be there, and the overall atmosphere of the diner had improved significantly. It was a dramatic shift from the tense, uncomfortable environment JD had witnessed on his undercover visit. For Megan and Connor, the recognition they had long deserved finally came. Megan received a well-deserved raise, and her dedication was no longer taken for granted. Connor was promoted to assistant manager, and with that promotion came more responsibility, a pay raise, and a newfound confidence in his role. The two of them worked together alongside the new manager to ensure the diner ran smoothly, and their hard work became the foundation of the positive changes taking place. As JD walked through the diner one afternoon, he took a moment to reflect on the changes that had been made and, more importantly, on what those changes had taught him about leadership. He had started his career focused on growth and expansion, constantly chasing profits and larger numbers. But this experience had reminded him of what really mattered: people. His time undercover had shown him the importance of empathy, respect, and creating a supportive environment for employees. A business could only thrive if its people thrived first. The bottom line would follow naturally when employees felt valued and motivated. JD couldn't help but smile as he watched Megan and Connor working together, helping customers with genuine smiles. He felt a sense of pride that went beyond the success of his business. This wasn't just about profits. It was about creating a place where people could come to work and feel like they mattered. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt confident in the direction he was taking. The diner was no longer just a business. It had become a community, one built on respect and trust, and JD was determined to ensure that it stayed that way. As he left the diner that day, JD felt a renewed sense of purpose. His undercover visit had been a wake-up call, one that forced him to reevaluate his priorities. The experience had reminded him that leadership wasn't just about making decisions from an office or pushing numbers, it was about the people who made the business run. And as he continued on his journey, he knew that would always be his guiding principle: